protests thrive in democracies, and by comparison, they tend to atrophy in authoritarian regimes with limited, no civil society or attendant freedoms. So the outline of my talk today is I'll start with the key arguments of the book, and then I'll move on to a number of tensions or caveats relating to voice. And there's three in particular. I discuss these in a bit more detail at the start of the book. One is around far right, which is appropriate. I know a lot of people in the Basic Bay have an interest around this topic. So the tensions around the far right and whether the far right have a political voice. The second is around visibility and voice. So and here it's about the conflation of visibility and voice in the academic literature. And finally, the relationship between silence and voice. So the withdrawal or withholding of voice and silence as a repertoire of communication. I'll then discuss protest and social movements in relation to democracy. And then I'll outline my concept of political voice, which is based around these three core elements: autonomy, representation, and constitution. In the book, I have two cases that I look at. So I don't do a comparative case study. So a lot of my work in the past is quite comparative. I basically apply this concept to two very different case studies. And I'll just focus on one of them today, which is queer pride and activism in India. And then I'll offer some reflections. So this is the book. The reason that I wanted to write the book was well, there was many reasons. One was a lot of my research has kind of looked at marginalized groups around the world. I've always been interested in notions of protest and democracy, and of course, different marginalized groups, from urban protest movements in Istanbul to environmental activists to queer movements and of course, Roma communities across Central and Eastern Europe. But the one thing that was kind of central, or the kind of red thread to all of this research, was notions of voice and and I was searching for a theory of voice. And the more I read, the more kind of confused I got, because I didn't really see a lot of clarity about what kind of voice was. Voice was often conflated with voting, with ideas of participation or representation or grassroots mobilization. And so this was an attempt to kind of theorize voice. To do this, I drew on a very interdisciplinary perspective. My background is IR, but actually I'm more of a political sociologist. But in order to write the book, I was engaging with theories of kind of theater studies and voice and esoteric kind of political theory and so on. So I really kind of read quite widely around voice to try and come up with a theory of voice that I find accurate and compelling. And the book itself, I have two case studies, as I mentioned. One is on LGBTIQ and queer activism in India, and the other is represented on the book cover, and that's the Roma flags. Blue represents the sky, and the green the earth, and the red is the kind of the wagon wheel, which is the symbol of Roma communities. So, in the book, I make a number of arguments. The first is that political voice is a rupture to the existing political order and to the kind of the status quo. So the idea is that voice disturbs norms, values, ideas, and orthodoxies. So it's civil disobedience in the sense that it kind of disturbs public tranquility. It doesn't mean that it's violent, but it means that it upends or challenges it. So it's an attempt to also change various kind of circumstances and ideas rather than escape from them. Political voice is also crucial for marginalized groups in particular. Marginalized groups are often dismissed, they are excluded, often silenced or misrecognized. And so here voice is reappropriated as an instrument of control. Political voice has a transformative impact through the articulation. So the articulation is the speaking of, the sharing, the expression of, and it carries a symbolic and material power. So it has a real impact in terms of its instrumental impact, potentially on laws and policies and changes of regimes, but also it has a symbolic power for the groups in question. I also explore the communicative power of voice through its articulation. So it communicates certain ideas and demands and interests. but also it is has a relational quality, so it demands some sort of reaction from external actors. So there's a dialogue, as you would expect from voice. Political voice reimagines the relationship between representation and democracy. So these kind of core elements that I look at. I mean, part of this was about reclaiming the relationship or kind of rethinking what representation means. So I'm critical of representative democracy, as I'll kind of outline in a moment. But I don't think that we should be kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as the expression goes, because representation is important to reveal hidden or uncovered kind of meanings and knowledge and positions and experiences, and as well as demands. And it's bound up with this kind of politics of presence. So this argument of Anne Phillips that if you're present in public life, then you are less likely to be ignored. It's something we can definitely criticize, but the argument is still there. And finally, political voice is public and collective. So of course there can be an individual voice and there can be private voice, but what I'm interested in is the public and collective manifestations. So it's how streets and squares, media and different arenas are harnessed in order to raise awareness. So I'll start with one of the first kind of tension or the caveats that is presented, and one is around the far right and whether the far right has a political voice. One thing that I look at is around kind of marginalization, and the literature on marginalization says that marginalization can be a prized status, so it can provide a platform or attention to an individual or a group. And in some respects, it is difficult to objectively determine. I mean, we could point to overrepresentation in prison populations, or life expectancy, or infant mortality rates, and so on. So there are objective criteria that we can use to determine whether a group is marginalized or not. But very often marginalization can be about self-identification of this, and therefore becomes somehow more difficult to determine. And in this regard, right-wing populists often claim to be marginalized, they claim to be silenced, they claim to be cancelled in different ways. And this all fuels what we might call a culture war based on claims to freedom of speech. So freedom of speech becomes a dog whistle for the far right. And just to give, well, two examples here, on the top right, you see this is a EDL march post-Brexit, which is, of course, identifying immigrants and kind of pushing against migration. And the bottom right, we see MAGA and the kind of in January the 6th and the uprising in Washington. And because right-wing populists claim to be marginalized, they claim to be silenced or claim to be cancelled, what we see is that their views are often considered by themselves to be marginal, but we know that they are on the rise. We know that they are motivated by these kind of like a more of a nativist logic, which is to protect the nation, so to protect the national or the majority identity. And we've seen the success of the far right, particularly in mainstreaming. And so mainstreaming is not only when these views that were once considered to be marginal or abhorrent in many ways are actively platformed in media discourse, in political parties, in the speeches made by presidents and prime ministers across the land. But the other success of mainstreaming is when those groups that are, and organizations like political parties that are on the center or on the left, have to move to the right in order to so-called claim back or try and save some of the votes. In the UK, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, made a speech last week on migration, where he said things that a Labour MP or Prime Minister would never have said 10 years ago. And that's because they're worried about hemorrhaging votes to the far right, and especially to reform. So the far right, these views are premised on the subjugation and the exclusion of others, which is what makes the far right different from other so-called marginalized groups. So, and actually very often they are kind of premised on the subjugation and exclusion of the very groups that I'm looking at, like Roma, indigenous communities, refugees, LGBT populations, and so on. And we also should point out that not all marginalized people are progressive. We have kind of examples of pinkwashing and homo nationalism in Israel elsewhere. The second tension I look at is around voice and visibility. And there's this tension that runs throughout the book between what we might call sound and sight, both of which are crucial for marginalized groups. So voice and visibility are frequently conflated in academic literature. Almost everything I read about visibility kind of talks about it as some sort of voice. And according to Briganti, one of the most authoritative kind of or recent studies on visibility says visibility is a complex field where the visible and the articulatable coexist rather than excluding one another. And so we have examples where if you see the example on the left, which is the 8th Memorial quilt, and this is laid out in Washington. So each of these quilts are kind of small kind of pieces of fabric, which is to represent the death of an individual from HIV/AIDS. And this was created in order to draw attention to the deaths of many kind of gay men in the US in the 1980s and the inaction of the government around this. So the Reagan administration effectively doing nothing. And this was a way of kind of drawing attention to laying out, these kind of individualized people who had lost their lives through the inaction of the government. And so visibility here is bound up with questions of recognition, agency, as well as intelligibility. And so the memorial quilt becomes this site of public commemoration. So it's built into kind of the memory, but the actual fabric of politics as well. Both voice and visibility draw on recognition, witnessing, and they're both very powerful tools of communication, and they both tend to be expressive rather than instrumental. So they're not necessarily engaging in these kind of means ends calculations in order to get what they want, but the expression and the articulation is kind of central to kind of building different forms of solidarity. The final tension that I look at is around voice and the kind of the material voice and silence. So voice is more than making noise, although sound is kind of crucial for protest movements. Anyone who's been on a protest or demonstration knows the power of kind of singing, chanting, drums, whistles, clapping, and kind of music, and so on. Actually, the sonic dimension is quite under-researched, I would say, in social movement studies, even though it's a really powerful part of it. And Adriana Cabrero makes the argument that the order of kind of politics from ancient Greece onwards has traditionally rejected the vocal as politically dangerous, destabilizing, and subversive. So she would make the argument that, in ancient Greece, only certain individuals, usually properly able-bodied, rich men, heterosexual, were able to speak in public. And any other kind of form of voice was seen as something which was inherently subversive and dangerous, and therefore should be tempered and silenced. But we also see historically, there's plenty of examples of the withdrawal of voice and the use of the withholding of voice as a powerful message. So silent protests was used by feminists in the 1970s as a refusal to engage in different structures which are designed to exclude. So like, why would I give credence to and legitimize a structure that is designed to exclude me? The withholding of one's voice and engaging in that becomes this repertoire of communication. And there's other examples. Martin Luther King did this, and here's another example of silent protests in Jerusalem in 1929. So one of the kind of central arguments that I'm looking at is this idea that democracy and the relationship between protest and democracy, and thinking about, well, does democracy need saving? And of course, yes, I would argue that it does. Democracy is in perpetual crisis. We have rising voter apathy, rising authoritarianism all around the world, increasing societal polarization, as well as the erosion of civil liberties, again, all over the world. But the biggest problem, I think, facing democracy is that people just do not feel that it works. They do not think that they are represented. They do not think that their voice is heard, and they do not feel that they have any sort of agency. And this is the kind of fundamental issue facing democratic regimes around the world. And part of the issue here is that democracy is built on these utilitarian principles. So we have a system of governance which means the greatest happiness of the greatest number. So it's a system of majority rule. And so in democracy, it's quite procedural. We have a mechanism to aggregate these votes, and these votes are then translated to a government, which then can enact a kind of mandate to change or enact kind of policies and laws. So we have quite a procedural, functional system, the purpose of which is to make sure that everybody is heard. But we know that this does not really always work out in the way that it is intended. And part of the issue is that both the democracy is built on these kind of pillars of participation and representation. So if you look at the canon of political theory and actually how electoral democracies have been manifest over the years, they focus on participation and representation. And both, I would say, are normatively good things. Participation is a good thing. Representation is also a good thing. My issue is that both participation and representation have been kind of blunted over the years to the point that we're left with quite a bland system where participation is reduced to voting every kind of 4 or sometimes 5 years, and a system of representation where people do not feel that they are represented. So this is not ideal. And whilst I'm critical of electoral democracy, I'm very supportive of democratic principles like participation and representation. One of the kind of arguments is that why do we still pursue electoral democracy? And one of these concerns is we fear what Hydra might emerge in its place if it were to fail. So here I'm talking about kind of fascism and the lurch to far right, which is and the rise of authoritarian regimes all over the world. And I do think, of course, this is a very real threat, absolutely worth kind of taking seriously. And so here, my argument is really to bolster democracy by reanimating its core values around agency, not abandon them. So protest actually benefits democracy by reminding us of its core purpose, which is to allow people to make themselves heard. Before we move on to thinking about kind of protest and different kind of action repertoires, I think another thing that we should remember about voice is historically society has actively excluded some people, in this case, women and slaves. So on the left, you see what's called a skull's bridle, and this is a torture device which was used on women from the 1500s to the 1800s. A skull's bridle is, if you look at where it says B, this is a kind of metal contraption which is kind of fitted or put upon a woman's head. And what you can't really see is that her tongue is being held with a metal clamp, kind of hold it in place. This was used for various reasons, including, she might have said something to her husband, or she might have kind of spoken up. And so this was a form of humiliation and torture. We also see examples of slaves being muzzled, and often this was in the context of transportation, but of course, whenever slaves were working as well, so they could not kind of speak back, they were also silenced. These come from the work of Imogen Tyler, who wrote this book, Stigma and Machinery of Inequality. And in both of these cases, the material voice, the actual kind of the noise that kind of comes through the compression of air through a larynx, that is being withheld. And I think in both of these instances, we can say that what is actually happening here is that there is a symbolic power to this, because the withdrawal or the withholding of someone's voice is basically saying you're not fully human, you cannot exercise your agency. And it also says your voice can be withdrawn, you can be silenced. And we might look at these and think, well, these are quite archaic medieval practices and a thing of the past. But if you looked at kind of a cursory glance at social media, different social media platforms, you'll see that women, Roma, refugees, trans folk are regularly shouted down, actively silenced, threatened with violence, sexual assault, simply for having the audacity of speaking up. And as Imogen Tyler says, she argues that they are kind of terrorized into silence. So the technologies of subjugation might have changed somewhat over the years, but this kind of audacity of hope of voice still provokes quite a hysterical reaction from some voters. So in terms of thinking about protest and speaking up and speaking out, we've seen this dramatic proliferation of protest movements around the world in the last 15 years. Many of you be very familiar with these. This is one example from the Gezi Park protest in Istanbul in 2013. There's many reasons for this. I mean, the truth is there's always been protest movements, social movements around. Whether there's more of them than before, I'm not so sure. Maybe they're more reported. But social media has certainly created a context where building networks of communication, particularly transnational networks, are definitely possible. This has strengths and weaknesses. But there is a lot of reporting in this in the media, mainstream media as well. And what we see through protests is that ordinary people are demanding rights, equality, justice, these kind of so-called post-material values, usually in opposition or resistance to elected representatives or the state. They're not always, but there is some sort of element of opposition where any movement is making these kind of demands in some way, shape, or form. And since the 1960s, with the emergence of these so-called new social movements, protest movements have led to progressive social change. I would argue that almost every progressive social change in the last 100 years have some sort of root in social movement action, sort of, kind of collective action in some way, shape, or form. Doesn't mean that repressive or regressive movements don't exist either. And when we're looking at progressive social change, this manifests in lots of different ways. The most obvious being laws, change in laws, change in policies, as well as change in attitudes. And of course, this takes much longer to do. But if you think about our attitudes towards the planet, our relationship with the planet, that's fundamentally changed since the 1950s. And a lot of this has because of social movement action and the more knowledge and research that we have on this. Very often, though, these protest movements are framed by formal politics and the mainstream media as dangerous and disruptive. So they're not seen as something that are public goods, that they're bringing benefits to society. They're seen as inconvenient, they're seen as subversive, they're seen as radical in a negative sense, and ultimately dangerous. And we see this kind of, I would say, in formal politics in the left and the right, and pretty much across the board in mainstream media. I won't kind of cover too much around what the protesters are actually doing, but suffice to say that protests can be articulated in a number of different ways, from more conventional kind of demonstrating and boycotting and striking and so on, through to displaying symbols and slogans, slang and rioting. All of this to say that protest covers a very wide spectrum of political action. It can be violent, it can be obedient, it can be quite dramatic, or it can be humdrum. And returning to the importance of voice. Voice has many different kind of roles in society. And part of that is, I think, is because these pillars of participation and representation, which are kind of upholding democracies, are very kind of safe and stable in supporting the edifice of democracy, whilst political voice has the power to transform these existing structures and rupture the status quo. So they have the potential to be more far-reaching than kind of the stability provided by these pillars of participation and representation. And for Adriana Cabrero, the articulation of voice is the realization of agency. And so when it's a subject becomes a narratable self. So the subject speaks itself into being. And of course, voice is very powerful and important for some groups. The example here on the right is the vote to Parliament. And this is in Australia in November in 2023, so 18 months ago. The Indigenous communities in Australia demanded a voice to Parliament. So Indigenous communities represent about 3.8% of the population in Australia. So they are in a minority. And they were dissatisfied with their political representation. So they demanded an institution or a system whereby their voice would feed into Parliament and they would be able to decide on laws and policies that were going to affect them directly. like a reasonable request. But they built this around voice. So they were demanding a voice to Parliament. The whole campaign was built around this notion of voice. And then the Australian government decided to have a referendum on this topic. I think it's debatable whether we should be having referendums on minorities, but Australia did this, and it was rejected. It was rejected by 60% of the population. And I mean, there's been kind of various kind of fallout because of this, but I thought it quite interesting that the whole campaign was built around notions of voice, and the campaign against was built in, you know, whether Indigenous Australians deserve to have a voice to Parliament, and whether there should be an institution to address their special interests. How it played out in media debates was essentially by demanding a voice, they were demanding more than what they deserve. So this all plays a crucial role for visibility, for recognition, for solidarity, as well as for consciousness raising and group identity formation. So the purpose of voice is kind of has many kind of there's many reasons for it. Consciousness raising, bringing visibility, group identity formation, which is something that I think a lot of social movement scholars we don't really look at. We look at the impact of any kind of collective action. We look at the impact of structures. We look at, does it work? Does it have a significant change? But we don't often look at the group identity formation itself, the inward dimension of social movements. It also has an educative effect on the public, so potentially revealing hidden knowledge, ideas, and experiences. And then this constitutive role built into identity, the creation of the group in the public sphere. So public political voice benefits democracy because it creates these diversity of experiences, different positions, demands, and knowledge, which in general will create more robust and informed political outcomes. I would argue that it doesn't have to do that, doesn't have to have this instrumental orientation, but it is an outcome nonetheless. Before I move on to the conceptualization of voice, I want to draw attention to one kind of, I would say, controversial theory which kind of underpins the notion of voice and silence, and that is the arguments of Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde, she basically makes the argument that if one does not speak up, or speak out and challenge justices, then there is a tacit acceptance in the status quo. And towards the end of her life, in the 1970s, she was diagnosed with cancer. And so she knew that the end was nigh, and she started to reflect on her own positions. And she wrote this incredible piece called The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. It's like an 11-page chapter, but it's a really phenomenal piece of work. And she says, I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood, that the speaking profits me beyond any other effect. And so Lorde is basically arguing that it is the duty of marginalized people to speak up and speak out no matter what the consequences, because we owe it to ourselves. She warns against staying silent, as inaction nurtures fear and is ultimately a betrayal to oneself. She says, what I regretted most were my silences. My silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. And so this idea that we should speak up and speak out no matter the outcome or no matter the consequences is controversial, because there are some cases where if you are a woman who is speaking up in, say, Saudi Arabia, or you're a queer activist in Russia and you're speaking up, there are real consequences to your actions, because there's different circumstances, there's different opportunities, there's different consequences, including imprisonment, including death, that could arise from articulating a particular articulating one's voice. And she also points out this kind of paradox of visibility, that we need to be visible in order to truly live, yet this public visibility heralds contempt, annihilation, potentially erasure, and judgment. And so kind of thinking about what this means for marginalized groups, is it fair that we expect this to play out in the same way in every single context? Okay, so moving on to the conceptualization of voice. I build this around three core elements. One is autonomy, one is representation, and the other is constitution. Each, I argue, is kind of fundamental to how we understand political voice. They're not involved in a zero-sum game. I presented this once to economists. They see this as a zero-sum triangle in this way, but it's not that. I see these as they're contested, they're in a dialogue with one another. More autonomy does not mean less constitution, more constitution does not mean less representation, and so on. But yeah, they're always involved in a dialogue, and they're all present. So autonomy is the freedom to articulate, to express opinions, and to be free to make demands. It's based on the conviction that agency rests with the groups themselves rather than on systems such as representative democracy. So it's freedom to articulate, express opinions, and the freedom, and to make demands. It also does not mean that you're going to get your way just because you make a demand, because you make a claim. It does not mean that people will listen to you necessarily, or that they're going to do as you asked. But it is the realization of agency. And I mean, following on from Audre Lorde's argument, this autonomy is a significant realization in and of itself. Representation is visibility and presence. Live representation has an external orientation, so it communicates demands which require a sort of reaction of external actors. And constitution is more inward facing, so it refers to the creation and the existence of a group. For me, constitution is, I think, probably the most complex and interesting of the three. So actors collectively speak themselves into being. It's bound up with notions of consciousness as well. And constitution here has more of an internal orientation, seeking to engage with members of the marginalized group, and also engage with those who might not see themselves as part of a marginalized group. So representation is more outward facing, and constitution is more inward facing. Okay, so I'll now discuss the case of queer activism and pride in India. Now, the case of India is quite complex and interesting because it maintained this antiquated British colonial law called Section 377, which was Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, and it was repealed in September 2018. So Section 377 was abolished after these kind of years of legal challenges, and basically 377 criminalized homosexuality, and that was what it did. So it's illegal to be gay in India until 2018. And also those who were challenging it argued that it was unconstitutional in terms of its application to private consensual adult sexual activity. So it builds around this kind of constitutional claim, that everything has to be equal and fair for all Indian citizens. Now, the repeal of Section 377 has been hailed as the largest ever single intervention in LGBT emancipation, as it applies to potentially one of the largest LGBT populations in the world. Now, the repeal of Section 377 came from various quarters, including from a kind of a coalition of queer and pro-queer individuals, organizations known as Voices Against 377, which was established in 2003. All this to say that this was not an overnight change. This took kind of years and years of mobilization. And Section 377 also was, whilst it was not invoked all the time, it was kind of used as a vehicle to marginalize and exclude queer people in India through arrest, blackmail, police harassment, physical violence, and so on. And also positioned the kind of queer community as this deviant other, which challenged sociocultural norms and was a potential threat to the fabric of society. And the final thing, just to kind of say on the journey towards 377, is that they thought that this was going to get repealed in 2013. They had this large kind of significant moment in 2013. And in the last moment, it was rejected by the Indian Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice said that they weren't going to he wasn't going to change the law because it only applies to a minuscule fraction of the population. And because they said minuscule fraction, the writing was on the wall, because discriminate against minuscule fraction or any single individual, it is not fair. It can't really kind of stand up in a case law. But they expected this moment to happen in 2013, and it was kind of put off for 5 years until 2018. Now, the ability of queer people to live their lives kind of openly will depend on a number of factors in India, depending on class, caste, on their financial independence from their parents, religion, education, whether they live in a city or an urban environment. And also, simply if you're a middle class gay man living in Mumbai, you might have a very different experience than if you're Dalit and also living in Mumbai. And so the queer community in India houses a wide array of identities, including Hitra, who are a third gender, not quite trans in the same way that we understand, as well as Koti, who are like effeminate men, cis men, and alongside and sometimes overlapping with lesbian, gay, bi, trans, intersex, and queer. And I say this because I think in a more kind of European context, we say LGBTIQ, whereas no one really uses that nomenclature in India. Everyone uses queer because they say it captures the complexity in a much more accurate way. And so I looked at political voice and how this was articulated in different ways. One of those is through queer pride parades. So I went to the first queer pride in Mumbai in 2019, and this was the first kind of pride event in the largest kind of most kind of, I would say, active LGBT or kind of queer scene in India, in Mumbai, and this was in early 2019. And so I'm going to apply the concept of political voice first around autonomy, then representation, and then constitution. So I wanted to look at this kind of public and collective manifestations of voice, and one was around kind of this kind of collective autonomy or coming out. So one thing that becomes clear is that those who were participating in this particular pride manifestation, there was a real excitement. It was a very dynamic and large, by relative standards, pride event in India. There was about 20,000 people who participated in this. So at the time, and I think it still remains the largest queer pride event ever in India. It happened on a Saturday afternoon in the Lamington Road area of Mumbai, which is Saturday being a very busy time, and Lamington Road area being a very busy residential commercial area. And this was something that the activists that I was interviewing were saying that they wanted the visibility, they wanted to generate that kind of attention. They also said that it was quite different from previous because the mood was much more jubilant, because before there was something that they were actively kind of fighting for and trying to change, the repeal of Section 377. And this time they said that the mood was quite different. It was also quite defiant as well. And one of the ways that it kind of changed was previously they would often give out masks, like eye masks, who were participating in these events in case they got photographed or that they would be identified. They were worried about being out in public or being identified as queer. And the various kind of participants that I was speaking to, they were talking about this as being this kind of collective coming out process. So there is this element of kind of reclaiming the streets, reclaiming kind of pavement, and declaring their belonging as the pride parade kind of snaked through the city. The parade itself lasted about an hour, so it takes like a long time. It wasn't a kind of small affair, and it was also interesting that there was very little kind of police presence, even though it drew a significant amount of attention. Basically, the whole of downtown Mumbai stopped to allow this to kind of pass through. But yeah, so the people that I spoke to, they were there. They saw this as a kind of a moment of collective autonomy, that they were kind of a collective coming out, where they were claiming belonging to the city, and they felt it as a quite a visceral experience for them. I was also interested in notions of individual autonomy. And in the book, I go into a bit more detail about the gay Gandhi. This is an individual. This is his name for himself. This is not a name that I allocated for him, but and others in fairness, have allocated to him. And his name is Ankil. And in 2013, I mentioned the case where they thought that the Section 377 was going to be repealed in 2013, and then it wasn't. The Supreme Court said only they weren't going to change the laws for a minuscule fraction of people. So in 2013, Anko was a young kind of queer activist, and on that day, because they expected the repeal of this decision, there was lots of media presence, and then there was a lot of disappointment. And so all the more established activists had to speak to national and international media, so CNN, BBC, and Times of India, and so on. And they were all speaking in English to these various kind of media outlets. Ankel realized that someone needed to kind of speak to the local media, so he was speaking to the local media and in different dialects and so on. And he spent the whole day. He said he was doing it for like 12 hours, and then on his way home, he lives about an hour outside of the center of Mumbai, and he takes this kind of slow train home, which kind of stops everywhere. And on the way home in the train, he decided to kind of share his frustration with the Supreme Court ruling. Remember this is 2013. And he thought this is the only way to change things, is if I stand up and I make myself heard, if I kind of draw attention to this injustice. So he stood up and he said, basically, that he was being discriminated against by the Indian Supreme Court and the Constitution, and this wasn't fair just because he loved somebody of the same gender. And he did this. He said that no one interacted with him, no one said anything to him, but he knew that they were listening because he was talking about a taboo subject around sex, or at least the subject of sex. And he did this, and he moved from kind of carriage to carriage. And at the end, he realized that this is what he needed to do. And so he decided to take his life savings, and he spent 5 months on the road, 6 months on the road, and he traveled to 5 different states in northwest India. And he traveled from kind of village to village because he thought the only way things are going to change is if I engage with local people speaking their language and say, kind of reveal what it's like to be a queer person in India and how unfair it is. And that's what he did. He traveled, in his own words, staying in the kind of sketchiest places. And typically he would kind of do this, and he would make a 5-minute speech on public transport. It could be a bus or a train, or at the vegetable market. That's where everybody was. And he said he estimated he gave about 500 speeches or 5-minute interventions throughout this time. Sometimes he was threatened with violence, or he was shouted down. Other times, a lot of people would just kind of come up and ask if they were kind of curious about what he was saying. What was significant about this, I thought, was that he said he did this for selfish reasons. He was not trying to kind of, do this for the greater good or the queer community, but he just thought if things are going to change for me, then this is something that I should do. So he said he was kind of motivated by this individual desire to change things, but it was a realization of autonomy as an individual. In terms of representation, I mean, there's different examples that I could look at, but one was I attended the Trans Day of Remembrance. This is an international day of remembrance for trans people, and remembering that representation has this external orientation, so it helps marginalized people to reveal knowledge and experience, ideas and struggles to the majority, and it's very different from kind of queer pride, which is very loud and kind of jubilant and vibrant intervention. And this was in the center of Delhi, and it involved a kind of dignified kind of candlelit protest. And here we have individuals, and these photographs that you see are from trans people who have died either by they've been killed, murdered, or they have died by suicide. And so what happened was each of these loved ones or friends or family of these individuals would hold up a photograph, and they would talk about what these people were like, how much they missed them, and what their hopes had been for them, and they just want to kind of share their story about who they were, and just to make sure that they were not forgotten. And then at the end, the images were laid down and surrounded by candles. And here it plays, or it shows a certain element of visibility around the existence of different people, as well as their struggles, and expresses in this sense trying to kind of fight back on shame, but also representation communicates struggle, knowledge, experience, and also the reality of living in a marginalized position, and also what the demands of the community actually are. And just to almost conclude, the final element I look at is constitution. So remembering that constitution is the act of establishing, creating, or setting up. So it requires quite a lot of internal identity work as marginalized people determine who they are, and then from the strategies for mobilization, representation, and autonomy are built. And one kind of way is that, or how can pride kind of manifests, is that pride is often an attempt to unite the community, to collectively stand together in public and articulate a political voice. But what becomes really clear in the case of India, and actually looked at kind of queer pride all over the world, is that this is a very heterogeneous group. It's not a homogenous group. It's not bounded and sharply defined as it shouldn't be. And actually, when standing together in public and articulating a voice, who gets to kind of set the agenda, who's making the claims, and how. And here's an example of a kind of queer Dalit. There was lots of examples of different kind of queer movements, queer prides, where the intersection of being queer were manifest, so being bi and queer, and how those intersections were often silenced, because those who are actively leading the movement tend to be male and middle class and living in an urban environment. And so is the movement itself really reflective of the various kind of concerns of the community, and what does this mean for the identity of the community as well? So pride is an attempt to harness this diversity and uses it ultimately as a strength to constitute the queer community as political subjects. Okay, so just to offer some final reflections, voice is the realization of agency. I argue, and here, according to Butler, we are able to give an account of ourselves. We're able to reveal ourselves, and according to Caballero, through the articulation of our voice, we become a narratable self. That we kind of speak ourselves into being. Political voice is a rupture to and of the existing political order. The existing political order being those norms, values, ideas, and orthodoxies that kind of are steady and in kind of dominant in our society. Voice is really a demand to be seen and to be heard, and this is especially important for marginalized groups. Struggle, resistance, and mobilization are, of course, fundamental principles for a healthy democratic society. You could have a democratic society without these things, probably, but probably wouldn't be very healthy. And these are things that we should be kind of actively nurturing and celebrating, not kind of labeling as dangerous and subversive. And political voice reveals meaning, knowledge, experiences, and identities, which might remain hidden or silenced otherwise. This is one of the kind of key roles of political voice, and they would often get kind of pushed to the side of the mandates of many political parties and form of politics. So to go back to the original question, is thinking about protest and democracy. Well, perhaps protest does not save democracy, but I do think that it enriches it, including by broadening the scope of what it means to participate and what it means to represent. Okay, thank you very much for your time.